There's a question that seems so simple, so obvious that we barely think about it anymore. Where did humans come from? And the answer we've all been taught is straightforward. Africa. Humanity started in Africa. Our ancestors evolved there. They developed bipedalism there. They invented tools there. And eventually they walked out of Africa and colonized the entire world. It's a nice, neat story with a clear beginning, a clear direction of travel, and a satisfying conclusion. Humanity's birthplace, humanity's exodus, humanity's triumph over geography and climate and distance. It gets repeated in textbooks, taught in classrooms, accepted as established fact. But here's the thing. If you actually look closely at the evidence, if you examine what we really know versus what we've assumed, that simple story starts to fall apart. The archaeological record is full of gaps and contradictions. The fossil evidence is fragmentary and contested. The genetic data keeps revealing populations in unexpected places at unexpected times. And the deeper you look, the more you realize that the story of human origins isn't simple at all. It's complicated, it's messy, it's full of mysteries we're still trying to solve. We think we know where humans came from. But the truth is, we're still not entirely sure how we got here, when we got here, or what route we actually took. And maybe, just maybe, we haven't got the whole story straight. Some of what we think we know is probably wrong. Some of what we've dismissed might be important, and some of what we should be investigating has barely been looked at. The African origin of humanity isn't a closed case. It's an open investigation with more questions than answers, more mysteries than certainties, more gaps in the record than solid evidence. So if you're settling in to fall asleep tonight, this is the perfect subject for you because these mysteries have been waiting hundreds of thousands of years already. They'll still be there tomorrow. There's no urgency, no deadline, no pressure to solve them tonight. Just the quiet comfort of knowing that we still don't fully understand our own story, that our history as a species is far more mysterious than we usually admit, that the greatest question humanity can ask about itself remains partly unanswered. So get comfortable, set down your phone when you're ready, let these questions wash over you, and let's explore together the greatest mystery of human existence. The question of where we came from and whether we really started in Africa at all. Consider what we actually know about human evolution. Not what we think we know, not what sounds reasonable, but what we can verify from the fossil record. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The fossil record of human evolution is shockingly incomplete. We have gaps spanning hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of years. We're looking at creatures that lived in small scattered populations across an enormous continent over millions of years. And we've found maybe a few thousand relevant fossils. Think about that probability for a second. You're trying to understand the development of a species spread across millions of square miles over millions of years using a handful of bone fragments. It's like trying to understand the entire history of Europe using 5 artifacts. It's like trying to reconstruct the biography of every person who ever lived using only scattered photographs. And those handful of artifacts aren't evenly distributed. Some time periods are relatively well represented. Others are almost complete blanks, huge stretches of human prehistory where we have almost nothing to work with. The fossil record is so incomplete that different scientists looking at the same evidence come to wildly different conclusions. Some argue that multiple human species coexisted and interbred for tens of thousands of years. Others say the lineage was mostly linear with replacements happening rapidly. Some see gradual transitions between species. Others see sudden jumps that don't make evolutionary sense. Everyone's looking at the same bones and reaching different conclusions, because there simply isn't enough material to definitively prove any one theory. The evidence is ambiguous, and that ambiguity matters. It means we should be uncertain. It means we should acknowledge what we don't know, and this is where Africa comes in. The current scientific consensus is that anatomically modern humans evolved in Africa sometime between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, maybe even more recently. The reasoning sounds solid. Most of the oldest fossils that are clearly us show up in Africa first. The genetic evidence suggests African populations are older and more diverse than populations elsewhere. But here's what's important to understand. This consensus is based on limited evidence, fragmentary evidence. We have maybe 24 fossils that are clearly or almost clearly anatomically modern humans, and they span hundreds of thousands of years and cover only a fraction of the African continent. We have no fossils from enormous regions and time periods. If there were human populations elsewhere, populations that didn't leave fossils, populations that didn't survive long enough to be represented in the record, how would we know? We wouldn't. We'd have no way to know. Because absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence when your evidence-gathering methodology is this random and incomplete. What if modern humans evolved in multiple locations simultaneously? What if there were populations in Asia or Europe that reached modern anatomy independently? What if there were multiple waves of migration and replacement and interbreeding that left us no clear trace in the fossil record? These scenarios seem unlikely based on what we know, but they're not impossible. And that uncertainty haunts every conversation about human origins. We're working with such fragmentary evidence that alternative scenarios remain on the table, waiting for new discoveries to prove them wrong or vindicate them. Picture the African savanna 200,000 years ago, or maybe it was 300,000 years ago, or maybe something in between. Honestly, dating these things is its own nightmare that we don't have time to get into. But whenever it was, somewhere in Africa, human populations with anatomy like ours were emerging. And here's the mystery that most people never think about. How did all the other human species disappear? And I don't mean just die out naturally over thousands of years. I mean, how did Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, all the other members of the human family vanish while we survived and thrived? The standard explanation is that we were just smarter, better toolmakers, better hunters, better problem solvers. We outcompeted them and took over their territories and drove them to extinction or assimilated them. Which is possible. Probably happened in some form. But the fossil record doesn't show clean replacements everywhere. In some places, yes, we see a clear succession where Neanderthals disappear and modern humans appear within a relatively short time frame. But in other places, we see overlaps, both populations living in the same region for thousands of years, sometimes thousands of miles apart, sometimes seemingly in the same area. How does that happen? If we were so much smarter, so much better, why did it take us so long to completely outcompete everyone else? Why were there these extended periods where multiple human species seemed to coexist? Why did some Neanderthal populations persist for thousands of years after modern humans arrived in Europe? Why did some populations in Southeast Asia show Homo erectus remains thousands of years after modern humans should have arrived? Something doesn't add up in the simple competition narrative. Some researchers have proposed that interbreeding happened, that modern humans mixed with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and that some populations today carry genetic traces of these encounters. And this is where the evidence gets really interesting, because genetics shows that non-African humans carry Neanderthal DNA. About 2 to 4% of the genome in Europeans and Asians comes from Neanderthals. Some populations have more, some have less. and there's evidence of Denisovan DNA in modern Asian and oceanic populations, high percentages of it in some island populations. So we didn't replace the other human species completely. We mixed with them, we interbred, we incorporated their genes into our population. But here's what we don't know. How much did we interbreed? Where did it happen? How many times did it happen? When exactly did these encounters occur? What did those mixed populations look like? How did they behave? What happened to them over generations? Were there populations that were mostly Neanderthal with some modern human ancestry? Were there populations that were mostly modern human with significant Neanderthal genes? Did these mixed populations have an advantage or a disadvantage? Did they spread successfully or die out? We found a handful of actual skeletons showing evidence of mixed ancestry, but they're incredibly rare. There must have been, and more. There must have been many more, perhaps hundreds of populations over thousands of years. But where are they? Did they leave no remains? Were they in parts of the world where fossils don't preserve? Were they in caves that collapsed and sealed the remains? Or have we just not found them yet? This is the second major gap in our understanding of human origins. Not just how we evolved as a species, but how we replaced, absorbed, and interacted with every other human species that ever existed. And we're only beginning to understand it. Every year, new genetic evidence emerges showing another population with unexpected admixture. Another hint of ancient interbreeding we didn't know about. And we're realizing that the history of human species is far messier than we imagined. Here's something that should really bother you. We're not sure when humans first reached the Americas. The conventional wisdom used to be that people arrived maybe 15,000 years ago across the Bering Strait land bridge. That seemed reasonable. That seemed to fit the evidence. Except the evidence doesn't fit. Archaeologists keep finding sites in the Americas with human occupation dates pushing back further and further, 30,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. Some sites have evidence that's hard to dismiss but also hard to confirm. And if humans were in the Americas that long ago, they couldn't have walked across the Bering Strait. That area would have been completely impassable for most of that time period. The land bridge existed at certain moments, but those moments don't line up conveniently with when we're finding evidence of human occupation. The dates don't match up, the timing's all wrong. So how did people get there? Maybe by boat. Coastal migration following the Pacific shoreline, which is possible. But it requires assuming that humans had sophisticated maritime technology and ocean-going knowledge hundreds of thousands of years before we have any clear evidence they did. Maybe there were multiple arrivals from different directions at different times. Maybe people came from across the Pacific from Asia. Maybe some people came along the coast and others came from across the Atlantic or even Europe. Maybe people were living in the Americas longer than we ever imagined. Maybe there are huge populations of ancient Americans whose remains we've never found because they lived in regions where preservation is poor, or where rising sea levels submerged their coastal settlements, or where modern development has destroyed the sites. We don't know. The uncertainty here is profound, and that's just the Americas. You could make similar arguments about Australia. The earliest definitive evidence of human occupation in Australia dates to maybe 65,000 years ago. Some evidence suggests earlier, but it's disputed. There's always dispute about these early dates. But if people got to Australia that long ago, they had to cross the water. The shortest water crossing between Southeast Asia and Australia is still over 100 kilometres. That's an ocean voyage, not a short one. Not an easy one, and we don't have clear evidence of humans with that kind of maritime capability 65,000 years ago, yet they must have had it. Because they got there somehow. The archaeological evidence is definitive. People were in Australia. So they had the technology. What kind of boats were they using? How sophisticated was their navigation? Did they do multiple exploratory voyages before finding Australia? Did they get incredibly lucky and stumble upon it by accident? We find almost no evidence of early maritime technology anywhere in the world. No ancient boats, no fishing implements, no evidence of driftwood-based rafting, nothing that would suggest humans had the capability to cross significant bodies of water until much later in prehistory. But they clearly did. They had to. Because people ended up in places you can only reach by water. So either we're missing the evidence, which is entirely possible, or human maritime capabilities were far more advanced much earlier than we've previously thought. And if that's true, what else were early humans capable of that we've never found evidence for? What other populations were scattered across the world that we don't know about? How many failed voyages are there that we'll never know about? How much of human prehistory are we just completely blind to because of the randomness of what gets preserved? Think about something else. The idea that Africa was humanity's only homeland is relatively recent. Our idea of human origins has shifted dramatically even within the last century. 100 years ago, many scientists thought humans originated in Asia. They pointed to fossil evidence in Java and called it early human development. The Java man became the leading candidate for human origins. Then more African fossils were found, more complete skeletons, more sophisticated dating techniques. The evidence seemed to swing toward Africa, and it's been staying there ever since. But what if the evidence that seemed to support African origins just happened to be what preserved well, and what was easy to find and excavate? What if there were equivalent human populations developing simultaneously in Asia, or Europe, or the Middle East that left no fossils? What if Africa wasn't special at all? What if it was just the place where we happened to find the most evidence? This is a genuinely unsettling thought for anthropology, because the entire framework of human evolution has been built on the assumption that Africa was the center, the origin point, the source, the motherland. But what if that's an artifact of preservation and excavation patterns rather than biological reality? What if humans were evolving in multiple locations? What if the transition to modern anatomy happened independently in different populations? What if Africa wasn't the homeland, but rather one homeland among several? The genetic evidence seems to argue against this. The diversity patterns in African DNA suggest African populations are older, more genetically diverse, but genetic patterns can be misleading. Population replacements and migrations can erase older genetic signatures. Bottlenecks can reduce diversity catastrophically. Founder effects can create the appearance of older populations from younger ones. You can have situations where a younger population replacing an older one still shows less diversity because of how genetic variation works and gets distributed. The genetic evidence isn't as definitive as we sometimes pretend it is. It's suggestive, it points in certain directions, but it doesn't prove that Africa was the only source of modern humans. Not definitively, not with the certainty that usually gets taught. Now here's where we enter really controversial territory. What if humanity didn't start in Africa at all? What if our understanding of where and when humans became human is fundamentally wrong? This isn't fringe thinking necessarily. Some serious researchers have proposed that we've been too focused on the African narrative and missed important evidence elsewhere. They point to fossil finds in the Middle East that are nearly as old as the African material. They point to sites in Asia with ambiguous dating that might be earlier than we think. They point to genetic evidence suggesting admixture between different populations at unexpected places and times. They're not saying humans definitely originated elsewhere. They're saying that the African origin theory is based on incomplete evidence, and we should be more open to other possibilities. And here's the thing, science thrives on questioning assumptions. But once a narrative becomes dominant, once it's taught in textbooks, once it becomes the consensus, once generations of researchers have built their entire careers on defending it, it's very hard to change. New evidence doesn't necessarily overturn it. New evidence gets reinterpreted to fit the existing framework. Dates get adjusted. Fossils get reclassified. The existing theory proves remarkably resilient. This happens in every field of science. The history of science is littered with examples of dominant theories that were eventually overturned. But in the study of human origins, the stakes feel higher. Because where we come from is part of how we understand who we are. It shapes how we see ourselves as a species. And if the answer to that question is uncertain, if there are genuine gaps and mysteries in our understanding, that's harder to accept than ambiguity in, say, the evolutionary history of mollusks. But here's what we have to accept. The fossil record of human evolution is too incomplete to support the certainty that we usually express. The genetic record is being rewritten constantly as new data emerges and new populations are tested. And the archaeological evidence for where humans lived before maybe 50,000 years ago is patchy and contested and full of interpretation. We have an increasingly clear picture of the last 50,000 years as the archaeological record becomes richer and more detailed. But before that, before we get back to the critical period of human development, we're largely guessing. And our guesses have been shaped by assumptions and biases, and the simple accident of where archaeologists have been digging and what preservation patterns happen to exist in different parts of the world. Consider the possibility that Africa was where modern humans first appeared, but they weren't alone. Elsewhere in the world, other populations were developing similar anatomy. Some of these populations thrived. Some died out. Some mixed with the African populations as people began moving around. The end result was that African-descended humans ended up colonizing most of the world, but not because they were inherently smarter or better. Just because of accidents of geography, climate, disease, and circumstance. The populations that happened to develop technologies for maritime travel first got to new lands first. The populations that happened to develop certain diseases got immunity and could displace populations that didn't. The groups that happened to encounter each other during favourable climate periods interbred and combined their strengths. Random events, contingency, the way evolution actually works. This narrative doesn't require any of our basic understanding of human evolution to be wrong. It just requires us to be more humble about how much we actually know, and how much we're inferring from limited evidence. Maybe modern humans did originate in Africa. The evidence does seem to lean that direction. But the origin story isn't nearly as clear or certain as we teach it. And there were almost certainly other human populations developing in parallel that didn't survive long enough to leave traces in the fossil record, or that left traces we haven't found yet. And that uncertainty, that gap in our knowledge, it's not a failure of science. It's just honesty about the limits of what we can determine from fragmentary evidence stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Here's what we know about the early migration out of Africa. Actually, no. Let me rephrase that. Here's what we think we know, keeping in mind that this understanding has changed dramatically in the last few decades and will probably change again in the future. Humans began leaving Africa at some point, maybe 100,000 years ago, maybe much earlier, maybe multiple times, with some populations going out and dying out and being replaced by other waves of migrants. They moved into the Middle East, and from there began exploring in different directions. Some went east toward Asia, some went north toward Europe, some eventually made it to Oceania and Australia and the Americas. They spread across the globe and adapted to every environment from tropical rainforests to frozen tundra, from high mountains to deep deserts, from islands to coastlines. And here's the mystery that really gets under your skin. How did they know where they were going? The early migrants didn't have maps. They didn't have knowledge of distant lands. They didn't have compasses or sextants or any navigational tools. They had no way of knowing if there were resources elsewhere. They were moving into completely unknown territory. Some groups probably died out in dead ends, reaching places with no food or water. Some probably tried multiple routes before finding viable ones. Some probably got stuck in certain regions for thousands of years before pushing onward. Others never went anywhere. The genetic record shows this. We see evidence of isolated populations that lasted for millennia before apparently being replaced or mixed with newcomers. We see dramatic bottlenecks where populations drop to tiny numbers, maybe dozens of individuals. We see expansion events where a small group suddenly fills vast territories, but we don't know the details. We don't know what drove these migrations. Was it population pressure from growing groups? Was it climate change making old lands uninhabitable? Was it simply curiosity and the human desire to explore? Was it a combination of all these factors? And we don't know how long specific migrations took. How many generations of people lived and died between the moment a population left Africa and the moment their descendants reached the Pacific coast? Was it a continuous slow migration, with each generation moving a little further, gradually expanding the territory? Or were there long periods of settlement punctuated by occasional sudden expansions? Did some populations take ocean routes that left no archaeological evidence, sailing along coastlines and island hopping? Did others follow coastlines where their sites are now underwater, drowned by rising sea levels? We're working with genetic signatures and scattered archaeological finds, trying to reconstruct journeys that took place tens of thousands of years ago across territories that have changed dramatically due to climate fluctuations and sea level shifts. It's like trying to reconstruct a conversation between two people based on a handful of words overheard by someone standing far away. You can catch the general direction, but the specific details are impossible to recover. And here's something that never gets mentioned in the simple Africa origin story. The people who left Africa didn't experience their journey as some grand migration. They weren't conscious of leaving their homeland to explore the world. They weren't thinking about history or legacy or creating the future of humanity. They were just hunting and gathering over familiar territories that gradually extended further and further as populations grew and resources became scarcer in established areas. They were probably unaware that their ancestors had come from Africa. They probably had their own origin stories, their own explanations for where they came from and why they were where they were. They probably told stories about ancestral heroes or spirits or animals that led them to their lands. Stories with religious significance and practical information woven together. And those stories probably contained real information, actual memories of migrations and hardships and discoveries, embedded in metaphor and myth and spiritual tea, Qing. But we've mostly dismissed those stories as primitive mythology rather than treating them as historical documents that might contain genuine information about human migration and settlement patterns and environmental knowledge, which means we've probably lost important information about early human history by not taking indigenous origin stories more seriously. By assuming the only real evidence is archaeological and genetic, by prioritizing Western scientific frameworks over other ways of understanding and preserving knowledge. If we had records, even fragmentary records, of what ancient peoples believed about their own origins, if we'd preserved those traditions and taken them seriously, we might be able to cross-reference that information with the genetic and archaeological data and get a much clearer picture of what actually happened. But most of those records are gone. They were lost in the gaps between prehistory and history, between the time when writing didn't exist and the time when writing systems became sophisticated enough to record complex narratives, between the time when information was preserved orally and the time when it could be preserved on stone or clay or paper. So where does this leave us? What's the current best understanding of human origins? Anatomically, modern humans likely originated in Africa sometime between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. They were not alone. Other human species existed, and in some cases we interbred with them. They gradually spread out across the world, reaching Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago, though possibly much earlier. As they spread, they adapted to new environments, developed new technologies, and created the first cultures and civilizations. And that's the narrative we're most confident about. The parts before that, before the clear archaeological record of permanent settlements and complex societies, those parts are much hazier. We have fossil evidence for human evolution, but it's fragmentary. We have genetic evidence for human migration, but it's being reinterpreted constantly. We have archaeological evidence for where humans lived, but there are huge gaps, and the older we go, the less evidence there is. And beyond all of that, there's a fundamental uncertainty. We're asking questions about events that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, involving people and populations that didn't leave written records and whose bones mostly turned to dust and blew away on the wind. We're asking what they believed, how they organized themselves, what routes they took, why they made the decisions they made. And there's no way to answer most of those questions definitively. We can make educated guesses, we can look at patterns in the evidence, we can construct narratives that seem consistent with what we've found. But we're always building these narratives on an incomplete foundation. The strongest theory isn't necessarily the right one. It's just the one that best explains the evidence we currently have, and that evidence could change tomorrow. So did humanity really start in Africa? Probably. The evidence does lean that direction. The genetic data, the fossil record, the patterns we see all point toward Africa as the most likely origin of anatomically modern humans. But the evidence is incomplete. The fossil record is fragmentary and full of gaps. Our confidence level should be lower than we usually express it when we teach these things in schools. There were almost certainly human populations in other places developing in ways we don't understand because we haven't found the evidence. There were almost certainly multiple waves of migration and mixing and replacement. There was definitely far more complexity and contingency in our evolutionary history than the simple linear narrative suggests. And there are absolutely mysteries remaining that we haven't solved and might never solve because the evidence just isn't there anymore. Buried under sediment or erased by time or lost beneath the oceans, the origins of humanity are shrouded in uncertainty, which doesn't mean we're wrong about the basic outlines, but it does mean we should be humble about how much we really know. It means we should be open to new evidence and new interpretations, and it means we should appreciate how little we actually understand about our own deep past, about the people who lived and died and left behind nothing but questions. The question of where we came from is one of the most profound questions humans can ask. It's the question that defines us. Who are we? Where did we come from? How did we get here? And the honest answer is that we still don't completely know. We have pieces of the puzzle. We're still looking for the rest. Maybe we'll find them. Maybe we never will. And maybe, in some ways, that's okay. Maybe it's actually comforting to know that mysteries still exist, that our own history remains partly hidden, that there's still so much to discover about who we are and where we've come from. but you can't let your mind relax yet. Not fully. Because the moment you think you've reached the answer, the moment the neat, out of Africa story clicks into place in your head like a finished puzzle, something quietly breaks it again. A date that's too old, a skull that doesn't fit, a genetic signal that suggests a population you've never seen in a museum display case, a coastline that used to be a continent, a missing corridor that used to be green, a trail that begins exactly where preservation is easiest, not where the journey actually began. So if you're listening and you're about to assume this is the final shape of the story, let me pull you back in for a second. Because the reason this topic keeps haunting people is not because the evidence is thin, it's because the evidence is biased. And once you understand the bias, once you see the machinery that filters what survives into the present, you realize something unsettling. We're not reconstructing the past from a complete archive. We are reconstructing it from what the planet happened to keep, from what the ground happened to preserve, from what water didn't erase, from what time didn't dissolve, from what politics didn't block, from what we happen to notice. And that means the simplest version of human origins isn't just incomplete, it's structurally tilted. It is a map drawn from the places where history is easiest to find, not necessarily where history was richest. So the video isn't finished, not even close. Because now we have to talk about the record itself, the real record, the one beneath the story, the one that decides what gets to count as evidence and what gets turned into silence. Start with something obvious that people still underestimate. Bones don't like the tropics. In a dry cave in a cool, stable environment, a bone can survive for tens of thousands of years, sometimes far longer, protected from bacteria, protected from water, protected from acidic soils. In a desert, a burial can hold its shape. In limestone, caves become vaults, but in warm, wet regions, the places where humans likely spent much of their time, organic material breaks down fast. Soil chemistry eats it, roots disturb it, animals scatter it, microbes dismantle it, rain moves sediments, rivers shift channels, floodplains erase surfaces and replace them with new layers. A few centuries can wipe out a campsite. A few thousand years can make a human presence vanish into nothing more than a faint chemical trace. So here is the first bias: preservation. The fossil record does not tell you where humans were. It tells you where humans were and where the environment agreed to keep the evidence. That's not the same thing. Now add a second bias: discovery. Even if evidence survives, it must be found. And what gets found depends on where people can search, where excavations are funded, where there is political stability, where there is infrastructure, where there are roads, where there is academic access, where permits are granted, where land isn't mined or built over or covered by modern cities. It depends on whether a site is exposed by erosion at the right moment, whether someone recognizes what they're seeing, whether it gets reported, whether the context is recorded properly, whether the artifacts end up in a lab rather than a private collection, whether the dating is done with care, whether the findings survive peer review. So here is the second bias: sampling. We are not sampling the past evenly. We are sampling the past where modern conditions allow, and that alone should make you cautious whenever someone speaks with absolute confidence about the first anything. Because first found is often mistaken for first existed. Now add a third bias, the kind of evidence we prioritize. Bones dramatic, so they dominate the story. A skull changes textbooks. A jawbone becomes a headline. A skeleton feels like truth because it looks like us. But bones are rare. Most humans who ever lived did not become fossils. Most died, decomposed, and vanished. So if you build your model of early human history around bones alone, you are building on the rarest category of evidence. You are building on the exceptions. Artifacts are more common, but they have their own problems. Stone tools preserve well, but they can be hard to interpret. A sharp-edged stone might be a tool or might be natural breakage. Fire evidence can be ambiguous. Wildfire or hearth. Cut marks on bone can be subtle. A layer can be disturbed. A site can be mixed by burrowing animals or geological processes, dragging younger objects downward or older objects upward, creating false associations. Which brings us to another brutal bias: time mixing. The Earth does not keep layers perfectly. People imagine archaeology like a cake, with neat layers you can slice. Real sites are often more like stirred soup. Roots, rodents, water, freeze-thaw cycles, earthquakes, slope erosion, all of it churns the record. And if you don't catch that, you can accidentally build a false timeline. You can date one thing and assume it applies to everything around it, when in reality the association is broken, so the record is biased. Preservation bias, sampling bias, evidence type bias, disturbance bias. And then, almost like a final insult, there is the greatest bias of all for human origins, the coastline bias. Because the coastline moved a lot. We talk about human migrations as if the continents were always shaped the way they are now. We draw arrows on modern maps. We imagine land bridges as narrow. We imagine coasts as stable lines. But during the last glacial maximum, sea levels were much lower than today. Vast areas of continental shelf were exposed as land. What is ocean now was once plains, valleys, river deltas, marshlands, lagoons, and coastal forests. And humans, being humans, would have been drawn to those zones. Coasts provide fish and shellfish. They provide predictable resources. They provide travel routes. They provide trade networks. They provide fresh water where rivers meet the sea. They are rich, crowded places, which means the most likely corridors for early migration, the easiest paths along a continent, were often coastal. And those coastlines are gone, they are underwater. So imagine what that does to our picture. Imagine if the most important early chapters of human dispersal were written along shorelines that are now drowned. Imagine if the campsites, the hearths, the burials, the tool-making spots, the early boats and rafts and fish traps. Imagine if all of that lies on the seabed. Then the story you tell based on surviving inland sites is going to look artificially sparse. It will look like humans appeared suddenly in certain places because the earlier coastal evidence is literally underwater. This is why the record makes migration look slower and later than it might have been. Not necessarily because humans weren't there earlier, but because the parts of the map that mattered most have been erased by sea level rise. And sea level rise wasn't a gentle, uniform process in human time. It was long-term, yes, but it could accelerate. It could come in pulses. It could reshape landscapes within lifetimes. A coastal plain could become a narrowing strip. A strip could become islands. Islands could become submerged. So populations would have been pushed inland, leaving behind their old world. And that old world is now silence. Now, let that sink in, a drowned human world. Not Atlantis in the fantasy sense. Just the reality that large areas of once inhabited land are now submerged. This alone should change how you imagine the first journeys. Because if you accept that, you can accept something else. You can accept that early humans were not always trapped to land. You can accept that water was not always an absolute barrier. It was a boundary, yes. It killed, it separated. But it also invited, it offered resources. And if you live near water for generations, you learn it. You learn currents, tides, winds, land signs, birds, cloud patterns, the taste of salt in the air, the shape of waves that reflect distant land, the way certain fish run at certain seasons. You don't need modern sailing technology to cross short stretches repeatedly. You need skill, and skill leaves almost no trace when the boats are made of wood and fibre, so the lack of boats in the archaeological record is not evidence of a lack of maritime life. It may be evidence of preservation bias again. Wood rots, fibre decays, and the coastal sites where boats would have been used are underwater. So the argument that humans couldn't have done X because we don't find boats begins to feel weak. We don't find boats because the evidence is in the wrong medium and the wrong location. We find stone, we find caves, we find bones in the right chemistry, and then we mistake that for the full picture. Now, this is the moment where the standard out of Africa narrative starts to wobble. Not because Africa isn't central, but because the way we imagine the dispersal becomes too clean. The popular version is like a single wave. A small group leaves Africa around a certain time, follows a certain corridor, and then spreads out neatly across the continents. But the real world doesn't behave like that. Populations move in pulses. They expand, they contract, they try routes and fail. They settle for a while and then retreat. They mingle with others. They leave traces that survive in some places and vanish in others. So what we call out of Africa might not be a single exit. It might be multiple exits across thousands of years, some of which left descendants and some of which died out. It might be a story of repeated attempts, with different routes opening and closing depending on climate. Because climate is another gatekeeper. It controls corridors. Think about North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Today you imagine harsh deserts, vast, dry barriers, but there were times in the past when these regions were greener, when rainfall patterns shifted, when lakes formed, when grasslands spread, when animals moved through, when humans could follow herds, could find water, could travel through zones that later became nearly impassable. These are often described as green Sahara periods, a term that captures the idea without needing you to memorize dates. The important point is that migration routes open and close like doors depending on climate. A corridor that is impossible in one era can become viable in another. So even if the origin of Homo sapiens is in Africa, the exit routes are not a single permanent highway. They are windows, and windows create pulses. Now hold this image. Doors opening and closing over millennia, with people moving when the door opens and being trapped or redirected when it closes. That is the kind of dynamic the real record suggests, not one clean wave, but multiple waves, multiple attempts, multiple interactions, many of which are missing from the physical record because the record is biased. Now we reach the part of the investigation that feels almost like cheating, because it bypasses many of the biases, at least partially. Genetics. DNA. The molecular record inside living people and ancient bones. This is the map that keeps changing, because every time geneticists add more samples, every time ancient DNA comes out of another cave, another burial, another tooth, the story shifts. Not always dramatically, but enough to disrupt the clean narrative, and there is a reason genetics is so powerful here. The genome is a history book written in inheritance. It carries signals of bottlenecks, expansions, admixture, separation, and migration. But, and this is crucial, it is not a perfect history book either. It has its own biases. It can be misread. It can be oversimplified. So we have to treat it like we treat the archaeological record, as evidence that needs interpretation. Let's start with the simplest idea. If a population splits, their genomes drift apart over time. If they remain separated, the differences accumulate. If they later mix again, those differences blend, leaving signatures of admixture. So by comparing genomes, you can infer relationships. Who is more closely related, who diverged earlier, who carries ancestry from multiple sources. But because humans have moved and mixed so much, those relationships are not a tree. They are a web, and that web is what breaks the simple story. Now, you've probably heard about mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome lineages, the Eve and Adam headlines that people love. Those can be useful, but they also create illusions because they track only a single maternal line and a single paternal line. They are narrow. They can make history look like a clean lineage because they are literally single lineages. But most of your ancestry is not on those lines. Most of your ancestry is in the autosomal genome, the recombining chromosomes you inherited from many ancestors. That is broader. That is messier. That is more informative, but harder to interpret. So when people say, genetics proved out of Africa, what they usually mean is, modern human genetic diversity is highest in Africa, and non-African populations carry only a subset of that diversity, consistent with a bottleneck as humans moved out. That is a strong pattern. But it's not the full story, because Africa is not a single population, and because non-African populations didn't just leave and then remain isolated. They mixed with other hominins, they mixed with each other. They received later gene flow back into Africa. They experienced multiple bottlenecks and expansions. So, out of Africa becomes less like a single arrow and more like an expanding network with feedback loops. Now, one of the most important genetic insights of the last decades is something that sounds obvious once you accept it, but it changes everything. Africa contains deep structure, deep ancient population structure, meaning different groups within Africa were separated enough for long enough that their lineages diverged significantly, even while they remained within the same continent. Africa is huge. It contains deserts, forests, savannas, mountains, coasts, river basins. It contains ecological barriers and corridors. Populations could be separated by distance, by environment, by disease zones, by cultural boundaries, by shifting climate. So the idea of a single African origin population is already too simple. It might have been multiple populations within Africa exchanging genes over long periods, a braided origin rather than a single source. This matters because if modern humans emerged within a structured African landscape, then, out of Africa, might have drawn from different regions at different times. Different waves could carry different slices of African diversity. Some could leave descendants, some could be absorbed, some could vanish. So the question shifts subtly. Not did humans come from Africa, but what kind of Africa? Which populations? Which regions? How many times? And over what timescale? Now, genetics introduces another unsettling idea. Ghost populations, ancestral groups that contributed to modern genomes but are not represented by any fossils we've found or any ancient DNA we've sampled yet. How do we know they existed? Because the genetic patterns don't fit a model without them. You see segments of ancestry that look too divergent to come from known populations. You see signals that suggested mixture with lineages that split off long ago. You can't always name them. You can't always map them to a place. But statistically, you can infer that something contributed. A missing chapter, a ghost. And that should not feel surprising if you remember the biases. Of course there are ghost populations. Most people left no bones we can recover. Most regions preserve poorly. Most coastlines are drowned. Our sampling is incomplete. So genetics begins to reveal what the ground cannot. It tells you, in effect, that the story includes actors you have not met yet. And now the popular narrative becomes fragile, because it was built as if the cast is complete. It isn't. Now there is another genetic truth that disrupts the simple picture even more. Back migration. The idea that movement was not one way. People imagine a one-way exit from Africa, but humans are humans. Once populations establish themselves outside, they can move back. Over thousands of years, gene flow can go both directions, and evidence suggests there were later movements into Africa from Eurasia at different times, not necessarily a single dramatic return, but multiple episodes. So Africa is not just a source, it is also a recipient. And that means modern African genetic diversity contains layers, deep, ancient layers and more recent layers, mixed, which means using modern genetics to reconstruct the earliest dispersals requires careful untangling. Again, the story is a web, not a single line. Now, if you're listening to all of this and thinking, so do we know anything at all? Yes, we know a great deal, but what we know is not the clean story people want. What we know is that modern humans likely originated in Africa in a broad sense, but within a complex structured continent with multiple interacting populations. We know that dispersals out of Africa were likely not a single event, but a set of movements over time shaped by climate windows and corridors. We know that once humans were outside Africa, they did not remain isolated. They mixed with other hominin lineages and with each other. We know that coastlines moved, drowning evidence of early coastal life. We know that the archaeological record is biased towards certain environments and regions. We know that genetics reveals admixture and missing contributors that the fossil record cannot show. That's already a lot, but it's not a tidy narrative. It's a living investigation. Now let's make this more concrete by imagining how the biases can trick us. Imagine you are looking for the earliest human presence in a region. Where do you search? You search in caves because caves preserve. You search in arid zones because bones and tools last longer. You search in places where erosion exposes layers. You search where local institutions can support excavations. So you end up with early evidence clustered in caves and dry regions. Then you look at your map and you say, humans appear here first. But maybe humans were also living in forests, along coasts, on floodplains, building temporary structures, leaving organic tools, fishing, gathering shellfish, moving with seasons. And those traces have vanished or are submerged. So the first appearance on your map becomes a preservation artifact. It becomes the first place the evidence survived, not the first place humans lived. This is why origin debates can be so misleading. They are often debates about preservation, not presence. And once you accept that, you can understand why the dates refuse to behave. Because dating is not just about measuring time. It is about measuring the age of the right thing in the right context. If you date a layer that was disturbed, you might assign an age to artifacts that don't belong to that layer. If you date charcoal that drifted from a younger fire into an older sediment crack, you can get a false old date. If you date a bone contaminated with newer carbon, you can get a false young date. If you date a mineral that was reset by heat, you can misinterpret its timing. So in early human archaeology, the stakes are high and the data is fragile. Which is why claims about extremely early dates in certain regions are often contested. Not because they are impossible in principle, but because the burden of proof is enormous. One contaminated sample can rewrite your conclusion. One mixed layer can create a false narrative, so serious researchers demand multiple lines of evidence, consistent stratigraphy, careful replication, and that rigor is good. But it also means the story will always lag behind reality, because reality happened regardless of whether we can prove it. Now, if you accept all of this, you can begin to understand why the Out of Africa story can be both broadly correct and still misleading in its popular form. Africa likely was the origin region of Homo sapiens, but that does not mean a single point. It may mean a network of populations across Africa, exchanging genes over long periods, gradually producing what we call modern humans. The origin may be a process, not a place. Then dispersal out of Africa may have been a process too, not one wave, many, some leaving no descendants, some leaving descendants, some mixing with local archaic populations and creating hybrids whose lineages persist in us. Then later movements reshape the picture again. So when you hear a clean date, humans left Africa at X, remember that it is a simplification. It might refer to a major successful dispersal that contributed most to modern non-African ancestry. But it does not erase earlier movements. It does not erase later back migrations. It does not erase complexity. It's a headline, not the full map. Now we should pause and let a deeper thought settle, because it's the key to why the topic feels like a mystery you can't stop thinking about. Human history before writing is not a story we can retrieve like a book. It is a story we must infer from leftovers, and leftovers are shaped by physical processes, so in a sense the planet itself decides which parts of the story we can ever know. The ocean rises and deletes coastlines, the jungle dissolves bone, the desert preserves, the cave protects, the river churns, the ice locks. So the narrative you inherit is partly an accident of geology, and that means your confidence should always be measured. But it also means you should not underestimate how much we can still learn, because the same modern tools that reveal drowned cities and hidden forests in other fields are starting to turn human origins into a higher resolution map. Underwater archaeology is advancing, remote sensing is advancing, ancient DNA sampling is expanding, statistical models are improving, and every time we get another sample, another tooth, another bone fragment, another genetic time point, the web becomes clearer, not finished, clearer, which is why you should not expect the story to stabilize. Not yet, maybe not ever. Now, here is the reframe that matters for the rest of the video. Instead of asking, where did humans come from? As if there is one answer, ask a different question. What were the corridors? What were the windows? What were the gatekeepers? Because the movement of humans across the world depends on geography and climate more than on myth. It depends on whether deserts were passable, whether coastlines existed, whether sea levels were low enough to expose land, whether islands were close enough to hop, whether forests provided resources, whether glaciers blocked routes, whether rivers formed barriers or highways. So to understand the first dispersals, we need to think like a creature moving through a changing landscape, not like a modern person drawing straight lines on a static globe. And that is where we go next. Because now we have to follow the gates. We have to follow the doorways, Levanten, Arabia, the coastal routes, the places where Africa meets Eurasia. We have to follow the water problem, Wallacea, Sahel, the first unavoidable crossings. We have to follow the Americas, where the dates resist tidy explanation and where the coastline problem becomes even more severe. And we have to follow the deeper question underneath all of it, even if we can map where humans went. What were they like when they arrived? Were they already modern in behaviour? Or did modern behaviour emerge in pulses, in different regions, at different times, under different pressures? That's the mystery that keeps opening. Because human origins isn't just about geography, it's about mind. It's about whether a human body can exist without the human culture we recognise. It's about whether us is a switch or a spectrum, and we haven't reached that part yet, not even close. So stay with me. Because the record is biased, yes. But when you learn how the bias works, you don't lose the story. You gain a new way to read it. And now we're going to read it the right way. Through corridors, drowned worlds, genetic ghosts, and the slow opening and closing of doors across deep time. And now we follow the gates. Because once you stop imagining human dispersal as a single clean arrow, the world stops looking like a static map and starts looking like a living system. Doors opening and closing, corridors turning green and then burning back into desert, rivers shifting, coast retreating, islands appearing and vanishing, and somewhere inside that shifting landscape, small populations of humans move, pause, split, merge, and sometimes disappear without leaving a trace. The first gate most people picture is the obvious one, the northeastern edge of Africa, the place where the continent narrows toward the Middle East, the Sinai, the Levant, that thin region of land connecting Africa to Eurasia, a natural bridge that looks almost designed for migration. It's the simplest route to imagine. You walk north, you cross out of Africa, and you're in a new world. And yes, humans did move through that corridor at various times. There is evidence of modern humans in the Levant far earlier than many people once believed. But here's the unsettling detail that complicates everything. The Levant may not have been a one-way exit. It may have been a revolving door, a place where populations entered and then retreated, a place where modern humans appeared and then vanished, a place where other human species were present too, where territories were contested not necessarily in war, but in slow ecological competition, in shifting climates, in resource patterns that changed year by year. In some periods, modern humans seem to be present in that region. In other periods, Neanderthals seem to dominate. Then modern humans again, then Neanderthals again, like a tide. Which means the first out-of-Africa movement you can detect might not be the one that led directly to all non-Africans alive today. It might be one of several early expansions that left traces and then died out, leaving no direct descendants in the modern gene pool, or leaving descendants so diluted and overwritten that the signal is hard to see. And this is where the story stops being comfortable. Because people want a single exodus, a single success, a single moment where humans leave Africa and never look back. But the planet doesn't work that way. If the Levant corridor became cold and dry at the wrong time, if resources declined, if competition increased, if small populations were stretched thin, they could collapse, they could retreat south, they could be replaced, they could vanish. And if they vanished, you might still find their bones by luck, and you might mistakenly interpret that as the beginning of the global spread, when in fact it was just one early attempt, a false start, a preview, a human footprint in a doorway that later closed. Now it's important to hold the emotional weight of that idea, because it changes how you interpret everything that comes next. The first time humans appear somewhere is not always the start of a continuous occupation. It can be a flicker, a temporary presence, a wave that breaks and falls back. So when you hear dates, humans were here at this time, you should quietly ask yourself another question. Did they stay? Did they leave descendants? Or did the landscape swallow that lineage? Because deep time is full of lost lineages, lost migrations, lost experiments. Now there's another gate that people often ignore because it's less visually satisfying on a modern map, the southern route. The idea that humans could have moved out of Africa not only through the Levant, but across or around the Red Sea region, through Bab el-Mandeb into Arabia, especially during periods when sea levels were lower and the crossing was narrower, and when the Arabian Peninsula was not the extreme desert we see today, but a landscape with more rainfall, more vegetation, more water sources. And again, this isn't a fantasy route. It's a plausible corridor that becomes more or less viable, depending on climate and sea level. This is where the idea of climate windows becomes central, because for much of the last few 100,000 years, the world oscillated between colder and warmer phases. Ice sheets expanded and retreated, sea levels dropped and rose, rainfall patterns shifted, monsoon systems strengthened and weakened, and regions that are nearly impassable today, like parts of North Africa and Arabia, could have been far more hospitable at certain times. Not perfect, not lush paradise, but passable. Enough water to move through, enough vegetation to support animals, enough predictable resources to allow human groups to travel and survive. So the exit routes out of Africa might not be a single permanent bridge. They might be intermittent openings that appear for a few thousand years and then close for tens of thousands, which means dispersal could happen in pulses. A window opens, a wave moves out. The window closes, that wave is isolated from Africa. Another window opens later, another wave moves out. Now, add to this the fact that humans are not moving like a military campaign with a target. They're moving as foragers, families, bands, small communities. They expand territories, follow herds, follow seasons, follow water, follow coastlines, follow what works. So a dispersal is not one journey. It's thousands of small decisions accumulating across generations. A coastline seems rich, so you stay near it. Then the coastline shifts. A river becomes unreliable, so you move. Another group appears, so you shift territory. A drought comes, so you follow a greener corridor. And over thousands of years, those local choices can produce a continental-scale movement. But it won't look like a straight line. It will look like a braided flow. Now, this is where the coastline problem returns with full force. Because if humans moved along coasts, and they almost certainly did in many regions, then the evidence for that movement is precisely the evidence we have the hardest time finding. Coastal campsites are not built to last. They're often temporary, seasonal, repeated, and then sea levels rise and drown the shelves. So when archaeologists look for the earliest traces of humans in South Asia, Southeast Asia, or along the southern rim of Eurasia, they're often looking inland, in caves, in river valleys, because those are the places where evidence survives. But the real migration highway might have been a narrow coastal strip that is now underwater, meaning the earliest evidence we find in these inland sites might represent humans who had already been present on the coast for thousands of years. It might represent a later expansion inland from an older, drowned coastal population. This is why some parts of the world seem to light up suddenly in the archaeological record. It might not be a sudden arrival. It might be the moment the record becomes visible. Now, if you accept this, you have to accept another uncomfortable implication. Early humans may have reached places earlier than we can currently prove, not because we need to believe in extraordinary claims, but because the structure of the evidence naturally hides the earliest coastal phases. And this matters enormously when you reach the next gate in the story, the water problem. Because there is one region of the world where you cannot tell the dispersal story without confronting water, not as a metaphor, as an actual barrier. Southeast Asia into Sahul, ancient Australia and New Guinea when sea levels were lower, and they formed a larger connected landmass. To reach Sahul, humans had to cross open water. Not necessarily enormous ocean voyages, but real crossings where land was out of sight or nearly out of sight, where currents mattered, where timing mattered, where you had to commit. And here's what makes this a turning point. Those crossings likely happened tens of thousands of years ago, long before agriculture, long before cities, long before writing. which means early humans were doing something we tend to reserve for advanced societies. They were navigating water. Now, people argue about how hard those crossings were. They debate distances. They debate whether land could be seen. They debate island chains. They debate whether accidents could explain it. Storms blowing rafts off course. They debate whether repeated accidental drift could deposit people until eventually a population stuck. But step back for a moment and ask a simple question. If reaching Sahel required crossing water, and if humans ended up there in numbers large enough to establish lasting populations, then whatever the exact mechanism was, it happened successfully, not once, repeatedly enough to sustain migration. Because one accidental crossing that deposits a few individuals is not enough to explain a deep, stable colonization across such a vast land. You need continuity. You need enough people. You need enough mixing to avoid immediate genetic collapse. And you need enough skill, or at least enough repeated opportunity, that the crossing happens more than once. So the water problem forces you to confront the possibility that early humans were more capable, more adaptable, and more willing to engage with maritime environments than we intuitively assume. And if you accept that, the rest of the global dispersal becomes less mysterious. Because once humans have the ability to cross water gaps in Southeast Asia, the idea of coastal movement, island hopping, and long-distance shoreline travel becomes far more plausible. It doesn't require modern ships. It requires a relationship with water, and humans have always had that relationship. Now, here is where the evidence becomes especially frustrating. The boats are gone, the rafts are gone, the fibers are gone, the wooden frames are gone, the paddles are gone. The shoreline sites where these things were built and used are often submerged, so you're left with indirect evidence. You're left with the simple, stubborn fact of presence. Humans are on the far side of water, and because the direct evidence is missing, people try to force the explanation into a narrow corridor of what we can comfortably imagine. But the comfortable imagination is not evidence. It's just imagination. The only honest posture here is to admit, early humans crossed water. Therefore they had some method of doing it, and whatever that method was, it worked well enough. Now, hold that thought, and follow it into a deeper implication. If early humans could cross water gaps into Sahul, they could also move along coastlines elsewhere with more confidence. They could exploit marine resources. They could travel in ways that leave fewer inland traces. They could spread faster along the edges of continents than a purely inland dispersal would allow. And this might help explain something that has long bothered researchers: the apparent speed of human spread once a successful dispersal occurs. Because if you look at the broad outlines, humans appear to have reached very distant places relatively quickly once a wave takes hold. That doesn't mean they sprinted across continents. It means that the movement, once underway, can propagate through repeated small expansions, especially along productive corridors like coasts and river systems. Now, the next gate is one of the most contested and emotionally charged in the entire story: the Americas. Because the Americas are the last major landmass humans colonized in the conventional narrative, and the timeline and routes are the subject of constant debate. For a long time, many people were taught a simple version. Humans crossed from Siberia into Alaska via a land bridge, Beringia, during the last ice age, and then moved south through an ice-free corridor when the glaciers retreated, eventually spreading across the continents. The Clovis-first model dominated for decades. A clean entry, a clean spread, a tidy story. But that story has been under pressure for a long time, because sites appear that seem older than the Clovis horizon, because genetic evidence suggests complex timing, because the ice-free corridor may not have been biologically viable at the earliest proposed times, because the coastline route remains plausible, and the coastline evidence is again submerged. So the Americas become another place where the record is biased, and the bias is magnified by the stakes. People care deeply about the peopling of the Americas. It's not just an academic question. It touches identity, politics, heritage, and national narratives, which means the scientific debate is conducted under extra heat. But if you strip away the emotion and look at the mechanics, the core problem is simple. To reach the Americas, humans had to move into Beringia, survive there, and then move south into the rest of the continents. But Beringia itself was not a narrow land bridge like people imagine. At lower sea levels, it was a broad region, an entire landscape connecting continents. Not a bridge you cross in a day, but a place you could live, hunt, and inhabit. And this leads to an idea that helps explain both genetics and archaeology in a more realistic way. The standstill. The possibility that populations entered Beringia and then stayed there for a long time, thousands of years, before moving further south. Not because they were waiting consciously, but because the glaciers and ecological barriers restricted movement. Because southward routes were blocked or harsh. Because the environment demanded adaptation. So instead of a quick crossing and immediate spread, you might have a long period of isolation and local adaptation in Beringia, followed by a later expansion when routes opened. This is the same doors and windows model again. The gate opens to Beringia, but the next gate, southward movement, opens later. Now consider what that does to the record. If a population lives in Beringia for thousands of years, they leave traces. But those traces might be hard to find because of permafrost dynamics, erosion, later flooding, and the challenges of excavating in remote regions. And if the coastal route was used, then again, the earliest campsites could be underwater. Then, when the route south opens, expansion happens fast. A small population can spread into a vast unoccupied land. Not because they are unusually driven, but because the ecological opportunity is enormous. And the archaeological record might then show a sudden appearance across wide regions, because earlier traces are hidden or erased, and because the expansion phase produces more visible sites. So again, sudden on the map can be delayed visibility. Now this is where the debate becomes difficult because people want dates, they want a number, they want humans arrived at X years ago. And the truth is, the answer depends on what you mean by arrived. Do you mean the first human footstep? Do you mean the first lasting population that left descendants? Do you mean the first widespread settlement? Because those could be different times. A small group could enter a region and vanish, leaving no descendants. Another group could enter later and become the primary ancestor line. The record might preserve the later group better. Genetics might reflect the successful group more than the failed one. So arrival is not a single moment. It is a process with multiple thresholds. And if you accept that, you can understand why the dates refuse to behave, because archaeology is trying to detect the earliest presence, which could be ephemeral. Genetics is trying to infer ancestry, which reflects successful lineages, and the two can diverge. Now add one more complication, the ice sheets. During glacial maxima, large parts of North America were covered by massive ice sheets. Those ice sheets created barriers. They shaped where humans could move. But when they retreated, they didn't retreat like a door opening neatly. They retreated unevenly. They created meltwater lakes. They created unstable landscapes. They created corridors that might exist physically, but not ecologically, meaning you could walk through but not survive because there was no food chain established yet. So the ice-free corridor idea is not simply a question of whether there was space between ice sheets. It's a question of whether that space supported life. And if it didn't, if it was barren, wet, chaotic, then humans might have needed another route. Which brings us back to the coast. A coastal route along the Pacific Rim, moving south by exploiting marine resources, fish, shellfish, kelp forests, could provide a continuous food corridor even when inland routes were blocked or inhospitable. This is often described as the kelp highway idea, and you don't need to memorize the phrase to grasp the logic. Coastal ecosystems can be productive and predictable. They can support movement, and again, the coastline problem returns like a curse. If early humans moved along the coast, many of their earliest sites are now underwater because sea levels rose after the Ice Age. So the route that might make the most ecological sense is also the route that leaves the least accessible evidence, which means debates about the first entry into the Americas are partly debates about submerged landscapes. People are arguing over a record that is missing its shoreline chapters. Now, bring this back to your earlier realization about Sahul. If early humans could cross water gaps into Australia tens of thousands of years ago, then coastal movement into the Americas becomes less implausible. It doesn't require blue water sailing across the Pacific. It requires coastline navigation, short crossings, and maritime foraging skills, the same kind of relationship with water. So again, the global story begins to rhyme. Now, at this point, you might feel overwhelmed with possibilities. Multiple waves out of Africa, multiple corridors, coastal routes drowned, inland routes opening and closing, failed dispersals, successful dispersals, ghost populations inferred from genetics, other hominins mixing, and then the last continents filling. It can feel like the story becomes ungraspable, but it doesn't have to be, because you can hold a simple model in your mind like a lantern. The model is this: humans spread through windows. They expand when conditions allow. They contract when conditions worsen. They leave traces unevenly because preservation is uneven. They mix when they meet. They sometimes fail. And the record we see is not the full flow, but the surviving fragments of that flow. If you hold that model, you can move through the complexity without needing a perfect timeline. Now we're approaching the deepest question beneath all these routes. Because even if we could trace every corridor and every window, there is still something we don't understand well enough. What were these humans like? Not anatomically, behaviorally. Because the phrase modern human hides a huge assumption. It assumes that once you have the anatomy, once you have the skull shape, the chin, the body proportions, you also have the mind we recognize. Language, symbolic thought, complex planning, art, ritual, social structure, technology. But what if those things didn't appear all at once? What if anatomy and behavior were not perfectly synchronized? What if modern was not a switch you flip, but a spectrum that emerged in pulses in different places at different times? Because when you look at the record, you see moments of startling sophistication. Beads, pigments, long-distance tool material transport, structured hearths, complex hunting strategies, and you also see long periods where the toolkits look stable, where change is slow, where the evidence for symbolic behavior is sparse. This doesn't mean the people were less human. It means the record of behavior is even more fragile than the record of bones. A necklace can vanish. Pigment use can leave faint traces. Wooden tools and fiber technologies disappear almost completely. Language leaves no fossil. Social complexity leaves indirect shadows. So our picture of behavioral modernity might be biased in the same way as everything else toward what preserves, which means it might look like symbolic behavior suddenly appears in the record, when in reality it may have existed earlier in forms we cannot see, or it might genuinely have intensified at certain periods due to demographic growth, social networks, and cultural accumulation. And that leads to one of the most important insights in this entire field. Culture can accelerate, not genetically, culturally. Once populations reach certain sizes and connectivity, innovations can spread and accumulate. Knowledge can be preserved and transmitted. Toolmaking can become more specialized. Symbolic traditions can become more elaborate. Social structures can become more complex. So behavioral modernity might be partly about population dynamics, about density and network size, rather than a single genetic mutation that turned on the modern mind. And if that's true, then the dispersal story becomes even more interesting. Because the behavior humans carried out of Africa may have varied by time and by group, early dispersals might have involved humans who were anatomically modern, but culturally different from later waves. Later dispersals might have carried more complex technologies, and interactions with other hominins could have influenced cultural exchange in ways we barely understand. Again, not a clean story, a braided one. Now here is the point where the investigation becomes almost intimate, because it forces you to imagine human lives without the certainty of our labels. Imagine a group of humans moving along a coastline 60,000 years ago. They know the tides, they know the seasons, they know where shellfish are abundant, they know which fish run when, they know how to make fire, they know how to shape stone, they have stories, myths, warnings, maps encoded in memory. They have language, because language is almost certainly ancient, but we can't prove it with fossils. They have social bonds, because humans cannot survive without them. Are they modern? What does the word even mean in that context? If they don't leave cave art, are they less modern? If they use pigments on skin that wash away, are we blind to it? If they carve wood and weave fibers that rot, are we missing half their technology? The truth is, we might be judging ancient minds by the wrong evidence. We judge them by the durable leftovers, stone and bone. But their real world was likely filled with perishable complexity. Wooden spears, fiber nets, baskets, clothing, shelters, boats, ropes, food processing methods, medicinal plant knowledge, social rituals, all of it mostly invisible. So when we ask, were they like us? The honest answer is, in some ways, yes, almost certainly. In other ways, we don't know, and the record may never tell us. But we can still build reasonable models, and one of the most reasonable models is that human cognitive capacity was largely present early, but the expression of that capacity in durable material culture depended on context, population size, resource stability, social networks, and the need for certain innovations. A small, isolated group might have sophisticated minds but leave a sparse material signature. A larger, interconnected population might leave richer traces. So the record can mislead you into thinking minds evolved, when what really changed was network and stability. And this is why the story of human origins is not just a question of where humans went. It's a question of how humans lived while moving, what technologies they used that vanished, what social structures allowed dispersal, what knowledge systems guided them through changing corridors. Now we are right at the edge of the next phase of the video, where we stop thinking only in terms of roots and start thinking in terms of capacity. Because to cross into Sahul, you need more than anatomy, you need coordination, you need planning. To survive Beringia, you need more than luck, you need ecological intelligence. To move through shifting deserts and green corridors, you need more than feet. you need knowledge of water and seasons. To spread along coast, you need more than curiosity. You need a relationship with the sea. So the next step is to take one corridor at a time and ask, what kind of humans could do this? Not in a romantic way, in a practical way. What tools did they need? What social organization? What food strategies? What cultural memory? And as we do that, the mystery deepens again, because the more capable early humans become in your imagination, the more you realize how much of their world is missing from the evidence. Which means the story might be older, richer, and stranger than the tidy version suggests. So stay with me, because now we're going to move through the first true threshold, the place where humans step beyond the land-bound assumptions we keep projecting onto them. And we're going to look at water not as a boundary, but as a pathway. Because the moment you stop treating the ocean as a wall, the entire map changes, not into fantasy, into something older and more realistic. A world where shorelines were highways, where beaches were larders, where tidal flats were calendars, where people learned the sea the way inland people learned forests, by repetition, by memory, by instinct sharpened into knowledge. And in that world, crossing water does not begin as a heroic voyage. It begins as daily life. It begins with wading, with collecting shellfish, with watching the tide rise and fall like a breathing creature. It begins with finding driftwood and realizing it floats under weight, with pushing a log, then sitting on it, then tying two together, then making something stable enough to carry a child across a channel. It begins with storms teaching harsh lessons, and survivors learning not to repeat the same mistakes. It begins with the simple truth that humans are problem solvers, and water is a problem that rewards solutions. So when you arrive at the Great Threshold, Southeast Asia, the broken geography of islands and channels, the region where the continents dissolve into scattered land, you should not imagine early humans staring at the sea like it is the edge of reality. You should imagine them living beside it, hearing it at night, smelling it before they see it, following it because it provides food when the forest is thin and the plain is dry, and then eventually moving across it, because beyond the last line of islands lies Sehul, the combined landmass of ancient Australia and New Guinea, larger during low sea levels than what we see on a modern map, but still separated by water from the Asian mainland. This is the point where the story forces you to accept something you can't unsee. If humans reached Sehul tens of thousands of years ago, then early humans were capable of repeated water crossings, not necessarily deep ocean exploration, not tall-masted ships, but deliberate movement over water, enough to establish populations, enough to carry genes across a boundary that cannot be walked. And once you accept that, you can feel the old assumptions loosen. Because the typical modern instinct is to treat pre-agricultural humans as land-bound, as if they were trapped by coastlines, trapped by rivers, trapped by channels. But humans have never been purely land-bound. Not when coasts are rich, not when rivers connect worlds, not when islands are visible on the horizon like invitations, not when the reward is a new hunting ground untouched by competitors. So you begin to see the dispersal story differently, not as a slow inland creep, but as a mixed pattern, coastal movement, river movement, seasonal movement, and sometimes water crossings that seem small on a map but are enormous in implication. Now pause and look at what makes this so hard to prove. You can prove stone tools, you can prove butchered bones, you can prove hearths in caves, but how do you prove a raft? How do you prove a boat made from timber and fibre? How do you prove rope? How do you prove nets? Those things are perishable. They vanish. and the places where they were most likely used, shorelines, estuaries, river mouths, are the places most likely to have been submerged or reworked by rising seas. So the maritime chapter of early human history is mostly invisible, but it is not absent. It is implied. Implied by outcomes, implied by presence, implied by the stubborn fact that humans appear beyond water barriers. So the honest approach is not to insist on a specific boat design or a specific technology. The honest approach is to say, some form of watercraft existed, some form of maritime skill existed, enough to make crossing possible, and then to admit the deeper truth. The lack of direct evidence is part of the story. It is not merely an inconvenience, it is a clue. It tells you where the missing world is. It tells you to look underwater. It tells you that the shorelines that shaped the earliest journeys are not where you stand today. Now, once you accept that humans were moving through maritime landscapes, you can return to the other contested gates with a calmer mind. Because you stop asking, could they, as if you're judging them by modern prejudice. You start asking, under what conditions would this be likely? And that is a better question. Because conditions are everything. Sea level, visibility between islands, currents, prevailing winds, climate windows that reduce storm frequency or increase calm periods, the distribution of resources that make certain routes viable, and human demographic pressure. Because sometimes movement is not the result of curiosity, but of necessity. A group grows, a territory becomes crowded, a drought hits, a conflict emerges, a new opportunity appears across a channel. Migration is often not a choice, it's the shape the world forces on you. So we can hold the Sahel threshold as a template, a demonstration, not of extraordinary genius, of ordinary human flexibility. Now take that template and apply it to the largest and most stubborn question after Australia, the Americas. Because the Americas are not just a geographic puzzle, they're a psychological puzzle, a puzzle of time, a puzzle of evidence, a puzzle of what counts as arrival. And the reason it remains debated is that it sits at the intersection of all the biases we've already discussed. Coastlines drowned, perishable technologies invisible, ice age landscapes transformed, sites disturbed, dating fragile, and enormous emotional investment in the outcome. So the clean story people learned, cross Beringia, go through the corridor, spread south, was never wrong in principle. It was just too neat, too confident, too certain that the first visible evidence is the first real presence. And as the decades have passed, the story has been pressured by anomalies, sites that appear older than expected, genetic patterns that suggest complexity, ecological constraints that make some proposed routes unlikely at certain times. So researchers have had to broaden their models. They have had to admit that entry could have involved more than one pathway, and perhaps more than one wave, and perhaps a long pause, which brings us back to Beringia. Because Beringia is often treated like a bridge you cross. But at low sea levels it was a vast region, a steppe-like landscape connecting continents, large enough to support life, large enough to trap a population in the sense that you could live there without immediately moving on. And in a world of glacial barriers, you can imagine a population entering this region and staying there for a long time. Not waiting in a conscious sense, just living, hunting, adapting, becoming tuned to cold. And then, when conditions changed, when glaciers retreated, when coastal routes opened, when the ecology south became viable, expanding rapidly into a new continent. This idea matters because it makes the sudden spread pattern in the archaeological record less mysterious. If a population is held at a gate for thousands of years, then when the gate finally opens, the movement can look fast, not because people suddenly became better at walking, but because the opportunity suddenly existed, and because the land beyond was enormous. And again, the coastal route becomes plausible here too, because if you have a maritime-capable population, capable in the modest Sahul sense, not in the empire sense, then moving along the Pacific Rim, exploiting marine resources, becomes a logical strategy when inland routes are blocked or ecologically barren. And the Pacific Rim is precisely the kind of place where early sites would be vulnerable to sea level rise, which means the earliest chapters could be underwater. Again. The same problem repeating in a new region. It's almost poetic in its cruelty. The routes we suspect are most likely the routes the planet erased best. Now you might feel the urge to demand a resolution, to choose a side, to select a date, to anchor the story in a single number. But a mature understanding of deep time refuses that comfort, because arrival is not one thing. There is the first arrival of any humans at all, maybe a small group. There is the first arrival that leads to lasting populations and clear archaeological signatures. There is the first arrival that leaves the majority of ancestry in modern people. These could be different times, different events, different waves, and the record may preserve them unevenly. So if you want to stay honest, you treat the peopling of the Americas as a process, not a moment. A process shaped by shifting ice, shifting coasts, and the kind of human flexibility that leaves few traces. Now, hold the map again. Africa, with its internal structure, Levantine doors opening and closing, southern routes through Arabia during greener windows, coastal movement along the southern rim of Eurasia, the island world of Southeast Asia, the water threshold into Sahul, the northern gate of Beringia, the possible coastal pathway into the Americas. And across all of it, the same lesson repeating. The story is not missing because humans weren't there. The story is missing because the planet doesn't preserve the parts we most need. Now, this brings us to the deepest layer beneath all these migrations, the layer that determines whether you even recognize the people in the story, behavior. Because you can map bones and roots all day and still miss the central question. What kind of humans were moving through these corridors? When did us emerge? And what does us even mean? The phrase anatomically modern gives you a body, a skeleton, a skull, a jawline, a pelvis. It tells you what kind of creature this was, but it does not tell you the inside. It does not tell you language. It does not tell you imagination. It does not tell you ritual. It does not tell you whether they looked up at the night sky and named the stars. It does not tell you what they feared. It does not tell you what they loved. And the reason we struggle with this question is that behavior fossilizes poorly. A stone tool is durable, but it is also limited. It tells you what kind of cutting and scraping they could do. It tells you some things about planning and technique. But it doesn't tell you the full toolkit, because the full toolkit likely included wood, fiber, leather, plant resins, and other materials that vanish. The difference between a simple toolkit and a complex toolkit might be mostly in the parts that rot. A wooden spear can be more deadly than a stone flake. A woven net can transform foraging. A basket can change how much you can carry. A rope can change how you climb. A boat can change the world. And yet those technologies can disappear from the record as if they never existed. So when we look at early human sites and see only stone, we are not seeing all of their technology. We are seeing the stone fraction. We are seeing the durable fraction. And we often mistake that fraction for the whole. Now there is a concept that helps you hold this without falling into either extreme, the extreme of they were just like us, and the extreme of they were primitive. The concept is that cognitive capacity and cultural expression are not identical. A population can have human-level cognitive capacity and still leave a sparse material record if the environment, demographics, and social connectivity do not push toward durable innovation. And conversely, a population can leave a rich record not necessarily because they suddenly gained a new brain mutation, but because their network size increased, their group density increased, their innovations spread more effectively, and their culture began to accumulate in a way that left more traces. Culture can accelerate without genetics changing. Innovation can become more cumulative when communities are larger and better connected. Knowledge can be preserved and built upon rather than lost. So behavioral modernity might not be a switch that flips. It might be a threshold phenomenon. A gradual strengthening of networks until culture becomes more stable, more complex, more visible, which means the archaeological record can create an illusion of sudden emergence. Not because the mind suddenly evolved, but because culture suddenly became durable enough to leave traces we can find. Now, this reframe is important because it prevents you from making the same mistake with behavior that we make with migration routes. Just because we don't see it early doesn't mean it wasn't there. But also, just because we imagine it doesn't mean it was identical to us. The honest posture is to accept uncertainty and build plausible models. And one plausible model is that language is old, very old, and that early humans likely had rich social worlds, stories, teaching and planning, but that the durable material signatures of those worlds are uneven, biased, and often erased. Another plausible model is that symbolic expression and long-distance exchange intensified over time as populations grew and networks expanded, producing more visible archaeological traces. Both can be true, both can coexist, and they can vary by region. Because again, the world is not one environment. Different regions preserve different things. Different regions support different population densities. Different regions encourage different subsistence strategies. So the behavior you see in the record may reflect regional ecologies and demographics as much as mind. Now, this brings us back to the roots again, but in a sharper way. Because if humans were crossing water into Sahel, that implies coordination, planning, social cooperation, shared knowledge. Maybe not formal navigation charts, but cultural knowledge transmitted across generations. Which season is safest? Which currents to avoid? How to build something that floats? How to keep fire alive? How to carry food and water? That is behavior. That is culture. So the act of dispersal itself is evidence of cognitive and social capacity, even if the artifacts are missing. Migration is not just movement, it is organization. And every gate we've discussed implies a different kind of organization. Moving through deserts implies water knowledge and seasonal timing. Crossing into Sahel implies maritime skill and coordination. Surviving Beringia implies cold adaptation, clothing, shelter, and food storage strategies. Spreading into the Americas implies flexibility across ecosystems, from coast to forest to grassland to mountains. So perhaps the most honest way to talk about behavioral modernity is not to ask for art first, or jewellery first, or carved figurines. It is to look at what humans did, where they went, what barriers they crossed, what environments they inhabited. Because those are behavioral tests too. Now, we have traced the gates. We have acknowledged the biases. We have allowed the map to become messy and real. So we come to the final quiet resolution, not a final answer but a final posture, a way of holding the mystery without being trapped by it. The posture is this: human origins is not one story. It is layers of stories. Africa as origin, yes, but Africa as a structured continent with deep diversity, not a single starting point. Dispersal out of Africa, yes, but not one wave. Multiple windows, multiple attempts, some lost, some successful. Migration along land corridors, yes, but also along drowned coastlines where evidence is missing. Water crossings into Sahul, yes, implying skills we rarely credit to early humans. The peopling of the Americas, yes, but as a process shaped by ice, coasts and invisibility. And through all of it, the realization that what we call the record is not an archive. It is a filter shaped by chemistry and geology and chance. So the truth is not that we know nothing. The truth is that what we know is a silhouette that becomes sharper as we find new evidence, but that will always have missing edges because the world destroyed so much of what once existed. And this is why the story will keep changing. Because we are not approaching a final textbook. We're approaching a moving frontier. Underwater archaeology will find new shorelines. Remote sensing will reveal hidden sites. Ancient DNA will pull histories out of fragments we once would have discarded. And every new data point will force the map to shift again. Not because scientists are confused, because the truth is complex. Now, if you are listening to this at night, in a warm room, maybe with your eyes half closed, this might feel like an unresolved ending, like we've built the tension and then refused to solve the case. But that is, in a way, the honest ending. Because deep time does not give you neat conclusions. It gives you probabilities. It gives you models. It gives you the humility to understand that the past is not obligated to be simple enough for the human mind to summarize. So here is the ending you can carry into sleep. The human story is older than the evidence we can see. It is broader than the caves we excavate. It is deeper than the bones we recover. It is written along coastlines that are now underwater, along riverbanks that have shifted 1,000 times, in forests that dissolved every trace, in deserts that preserved only what happened to fall into the right kind of ground. We came from Africa, almost certainly, but not from one place, not in one moment, not in one clean wave. We moved through windows, we crossed thresholds, we adapted, we mixed, we lost lineages, we began again. And the world kept erasing us as we went, leaving only scattered proofs that we must stitch into a map. So when you hear someone speak about human origins with absolute certainty, when they say, "This is exactly how it happened," you can let that certainty pass through you without holding it. Because the real story is not certainty. It is investigation. It is the slow, careful work of listening to fragments. And in the quiet of that work, you can feel something almost comforting. The idea that you're not just a modern person in a modern room. You're the descendant of countless crossings, across deserts, across rivers, across oceans, across ice age plains. You carry the memory of doors that opened and closed, of coastlines that drowned, of worlds that vanished, and yet the line continued. It continued through people whose names are lost, whose tools rotted, whose songs disappeared, whose footprints were washed away, but whose children lived, and that is why you are here. So now, let the map fade, not because it doesn't matter, because you don't have to hold it all at once. You can let your mind release the need for a final answer. You can let the mystery remain a horizon, not a problem. Because the past will still be there tomorrow, still waiting under the sea, still waiting in caves, still waiting in bones we haven't found yet, still waiting in the quiet signals inside DNA. And tonight, you don't need to solve it. Tonight, you can simply rest in the scale of it, the vastness, the slow movement of humans across a changing planet. the fact that history is not a straight line, but a living thing. So close your eyes, let the doors and corridors soften into darkness, let the ocean become a low, distant sound, let the questions grow quiet, and let your body do what bodies have always done through every era of this long, unfinished story. Breathe, recover, sleep,